The call came after the conflict was already underway, not before tensions rose, not during quiet diplomacy, but in the middle of an active war involving the United States, Israel, and Iran. And the message was direct: stop. But before we get to what that call actually means and why it matters right now, there's something else sitting underneath it, something quieter, but just as important. Because this wasn't just a statement, it was a signal about where Europe stands, and maybe more importantly, where it doesn't. The European Union, through its foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, stepped forward with a public appeal, not a suggestion, not a vague expression of concern. A clear call directed at both the United States and Israel to bring an end to the ongoing war with Iran. Think about that for a moment. Two of the most powerful military actors currently engaged in an active conflict being asked to stop by a third party that is choosing not to join them. That's not just diplomacy, that's positioning, and it came with something else attached, an emphasis on de-escalation, on stepping back, on finding a peaceful path forward rather than continuing down a military one. But here's where it gets more complicated, because while that call for peace was being made publicly behind the scenes, there were already ongoing discussions, conversations not just within Europe, but extending outward into the Middle East. Diplomatic efforts were already in motion. Which raises a question. If diplomacy is already happening, why make the call so publicly now? Hold that thought. Because Kaja Kallas didn't just speak about ending the war. She pointed to something more specific: active engagement with Middle Eastern countries. That means communication lines are open. That means coordination is happening. That means this isn't a reactive statement. It's part of a broader effort. A structured attempt to bring multiple players into a conversation that could potentially reshape what happens next. Picture the complexity of that for a second. Different governments, different interests, different stakes in the outcome of this war, and yet those conversations are happening. At the same time, another layer begins to emerge, because while diplomacy is being emphasized, the European Union is also drawing a line, quietly but clearly, around what it is not willing to do. And that line runs straight through one of the most strategically sensitive locations in the world, the Strait of Hormuz. The EU has expressed reluctance to engage militarily there. Reluctance, not refusal, not a firm no, but a deliberate hesitation. And in international politics, hesitation can be just as meaningful as action. The Strait of Hormuz isn't just another location. It's a critical passageway, a narrow corridor through which a significant portion of global maritime activity flows. So when the EU signals reluctance to deploy military involvement there, that's not a minor detail. That's a statement of boundaries. And it introduces another question. If the EU is urging others to stop the war, but also signaling it won't step into certain military roles, what exactly is its strategy? Because urging peace while limiting military engagement creates a very specific kind of role, one that leans heavily on diplomacy and away from direct confrontation. Now, layered on top of all of this, there's another thread running through the story: the United Nations. Discussions are ongoing with the UN about maritime security solutions, not hypothetical discussions, not future plans, ongoing conversations. That means coordination at a global level. It means that while one part of the world is engaged in active conflict, another part is actively working to stabilize the spaces around it, particularly the waterways that could be affected. Think about how those two realities exist at the same time. Conflict on one side, coordination on the other, and sitting between them, the European Union making a public appeal for de-escalation while engaging in diplomatic efforts behind the scenes. Here's the quote that hangs over all of this: sometimes the loudest message is the one that asks for silence. Because that's what this is: a call to stop, a push toward diplomacy, a reluctance to escalate militarily in key areas, and ongoing discussions about how to manage the consequences of a war that is already unfolding. But we're still left with that earlier question: why now? Why make this call publicly at this moment when diplomatic efforts are already underway? Because the timing, that's where the real story begins to take shape. And what happens next will start to answer that. Before we move forward, if thoughtful, fact-driven analysis matters to you, I invite you to subscribe and turn on notifications so you can stay fully informed. That question, why now, starts to answer itself the moment you follow the movement behind the words. because this wasn't a sudden reaction. It was a coordinated step layered on top of something already in progress. Kaja Kallas made it clear that diplomatic efforts were not just being considered, they were already underway. Active engagement with Middle Eastern countries was happening in real time. That means conversations were already taking place across borders, across governments, across interests that do not always align. Think about the timing of that. A war is ongoing, military actions are already in motion, and at the same time, diplomatic channels are open, active, and being used. Those two realities are moving side by side. Now, here's where it becomes more precise. The European Union is not just speaking broadly about peace, it is actively positioning itself within a network of dialogue that includes countries directly connected to the region where the conflict is unfolding. That matters. Because diplomacy at that level is not abstract. It involves coordination, negotiation, and constant communication. And it suggests something very specific, that the EU is trying to influence the direction of events without becoming a direct participant in the conflict itself. That balance is delicate. On one hand, there is a clear call for de-escalation. On the other, there is a careful avoidance of military involvement in a critical area, the Strait of Hormuz. Let's slow that down for a second. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another geographic location. It is a narrow passage with global importance. Movement through it affects maritime activity in ways that extend far beyond the immediate region. And the EU's position is not to engage militarily there, not at this stage. That choice carries weight, because in a moment where conflict could expand into surrounding areas, choosing not to deploy military force in a key location is itself a form of strategy. It defines the limits of involvement, it signals priorities, and it shapes expectations, both for allies and for those directly involved in the conflict. But here's the part that begins to connect everything. While stepping back from military engagement in that region, the European Union is simultaneously stepping forward in another space, maritime security discussions with the United Nations. That's not a contradiction, it's a shift in approach. Instead of deploying military assets, the focus turns to coordination, to frameworks, to solutions that operate through international cooperation rather than unilateral action. Discussions with the United Nations are ongoing, which means the effort is not static. It's evolving. Imagine the layers here. A war involving multiple powerful actors, diplomatic conversations happening across the Middle East, a strategic decision to avoid military engagement in a critical maritime corridor, and at the same time, coordination with a global institution to address security concerns in that same corridor, all of it happening at once, and none of it accidental. Because when you place those pieces together, a pattern starts to form. The European Union is not inserting itself into the conflict as a military force. It is inserting itself as a diplomatic actor and as a coordinating presence in areas affected by the conflict. That distinction matters. It changes how influence is applied. It changes how outcomes are pursued. And it raises another question, one that becomes harder to ignore as these details come into focus. If the EU is choosing diplomacy over military action and coordination over direct engagement, what impact does that actually have on the course of the war itself? Because influence without force depends entirely on whether others respond. And that's where the tension builds. The United States and Israel are the ones being called upon to end the war. The European Union is the one making that call. And in between them, diplomacy is unfolding, conversations are happening, and international coordination is being explored. But none of that guarantees a result. Here's the quote that settles into that uncertainty. Not every decision is about action. Some define restraint. That's what we're seeing here. A defined restraint, a deliberate choice to engage through dialogue rather than deployment. And yet that choice doesn't exist in isolation. Because while the EU is setting its boundaries, the conflict itself continues. And that brings us to the next layer. What happens when calls for de-escalation meet the reality of an ongoing war? What changes and what doesn't? That's where the final piece of this story comes into view. What changes and what doesn't? That question sits at the center of everything that has unfolded. Because by the time the European Union issued its call, the war involving the United States, Israel, and Iran was already in motion. Not building, not threatening, active. And yet, into that reality came a clear appeal for de-escalation, not backed by military deployment, not reinforced by force, but carried through diplomacy, coordination, and restraint. Now think about that contrast for a moment. On one side, active conflict. On the other, a structured effort to bring that conflict to a stop without entering it. That's the position the European Union has chosen. Kaja Kallas' statement did not introduce new facts about the war itself. It did something different. It defined a stance. A stance that emphasizes peaceful solutions, a stance that prioritizes diplomatic engagement with Middle Eastern countries, a stance that avoids military involvement in the Strait of Hormuz, and a stance that turns toward the United Nations for maritime security discussions instead of acting alone. Each of those elements connects. Each of them reinforces the same approach. And together, they form a consistent message. De-escalation is not just a goal, it is the method. But here's where the weight of that approach becomes clear. Because a call for peace, no matter how direct, exists within a larger system of decisions made by multiple actors. The United States and Israel are the ones being urged to end the war. Iran is part of the ongoing conflict. The European Union is not issuing commands, it is making an appeal. And that distinction shapes everything, because an appeal depends on response. Now return to the diplomatic efforts already underway. Engagement with Middle Eastern countries is not separate from this call, it is part of it. Those conversations are the mechanism through which de-escalation could potentially take shape. They are the channels through which positions can shift. They are the spaces where outcomes are negotiated. And at the same time, discussions with the United Nations about maritime security are addressing the broader environment around the conflict, not the war itself, but the conditions surrounding it, the movement of vessels, the safety of critical waterways, the stability of a region that connects far beyond its immediate geography. Picture how those layers interact, a war that continues, diplomatic conversations attempting to influence it, international coordination working to contain its effects, and a public call that brings all of those efforts into a single visible moment. That's what this is, a convergence, not of actions, but of positions. And it leads back to the central tension. What happens when a call for de-escalation meets an ongoing war? The answer, at least here, is not immediate change. It is a shift in pressure, a shift in emphasis, a shift in how the situation is being approached by one of the world's major political blocs. But the outcome remains dependent on others. Here's the quote that brings that reality into focus. Sometimes the most powerful move is choosing not to escalate, because that's what defines this moment for the European Union, not what it is doing militarily, but what it is choosing not to do, not entering the Strait of Hormuz with force, not joining the conflict directly, instead working through diplomacy, through dialogue, through coordination with the United Nations, and through a public call that places de-escalation at the center of its position. Now step back and look at the full arc. A war is underway, a call is made to end it. Diplomatic efforts are already in motion. Military involvement in a key region is deliberately avoided, and international discussions are shaping how the surrounding environment is managed, all of it connected, all of it unfolding at the same time, and all of it pointing toward a single idea that even in the middle of conflict, there are parallel efforts to stop it without becoming part of it. Think about that for a second, because in a moment defined by action, one of the most significant moves is restraint. And that restraint is the story.